theories of a group calling themselves by the new and unfamiliar name of economists. Their founder was a royal doctor, Quesnay, who in a number of articles in the Encyclopédie in 1756 and later in his Tableau économique 1758 argued in curious parallel to Rousseau that there existed a natural benevolent economic order which had been distorted by ill-judged and artificial human intervention. Economic wealth could only be unlocked by removing all unnatural burdens, particularly on agriculture, which was the only true productive activity. These ideas were developed by a number of other authors throughout the 1760s, including Mirabeau, Lemercier de la Rivière, and Dupont de Nemours, whose book Physiocracy 1768 gave the economists an alternative name. Paradoxically, the economic freedom preached by the physiocrats implied a powerful interventionist role for governments, for only they had the strength to sweep away artificial impediments to the natural economic order. Lemercier even advocated a sort of despotism, which he called legal because its sole purpose would be to bring in the greatest of all laws, that of nature itself. Ministers had no wish to be thought despotic, but they were attracted to physiocracy because it promised wealth. A natural free market with all artificial constraints removed would make producers rich. They could then pay more taxes. As Quesnay had put it in the Encyclopédie, poor peasant, poor kingdom. The constraints on free production were, of course, innumerable. Customary and collective methods, feudal dues, indirect taxes, internal tolls and customs barriers, productive monopolies like guilds, local and sectional privileges. No wonder it would take a despot to remove them all. But one seemed easier to deal with than the others, since it had always been closely coordinated by the central government. The whole elaborate apparatus of controls on the grain trade, fixing prices and limiting export and even interprovincial commerce seemed ripe for rationalization. The trade had always been so carefully controlled, of course, because guaranteed supplies of bread were deemed fundamental in ensuring public order. But physiocrats argued that freedom would create greater abundance, thereby banishing the fears immemorially associated with famine. Accordingly, in May 1763, a free internal market in grain was proclaimed, and just over a year later, free export was also allowed when prices were below a certain level. A generation's good harvests underlay the optimism behind this policy, but in the late 1760s, they came to an end. When crops failed, no amount of administrative tinkering could guarantee abundance, and the new freedom was blamed for aggravating, if not causing, the shortages of these years. A furious public debate broke out, in which partisans of the old controls accused the reformers of starving the king's subjects and abandoning, at the behest of visionary theorists, the crown's age-old commitment to keeping them alive. To arguments that in the long run, the high prices resulting from lack of controls would stimulate production and so eventually bring down prices. Magistrates facing bread riots replied by urging practical realism. The people are not wrong to complain. They are in no state to pay for their bread, wrote the first president of the Parliament of Bordeaux to the province's governor in 1773, after tumults which he thought had come within inches of putting the city to sack. Their normal remark is to say, "We prefer to die on a gibbet rather than die of hunger. It's shorter. Why insist on keeping up the price of bread? As for me, I confess, it seems to me that in a country where taxes are carried to excess, the king is bound to assure his subjects the only thing they have left, their lives." Faced with such problems, ministers wavered, but attempts to reimpose controls through preferential contracting in the early 1770s scarcely restored confidence. They were now accused of deliberately plotting to starve the people by a famine pact, which put the trade in the hands of a profiteering private monopoly. Around 1770, in fact, confidence in the way France was governed in general rapidly began to run out. Although some of the losses of the 7 Years' War were made up with the annexation of Lorraine 1766 and Corsica 1768. The Austrian alliance, which survived the war, remained deeply unpopular. When it was renewed in 1770, with the marriage of Louis XV's grandson and heir to the Archduchess Marie Antoinette, celebrations in Paris went wrong, and 136 people were killed when a crowd stampeded. It seemed like an omen, and the feasting which continued at Versailles left bitter memories in the capital. By now, the insatiable sexual appetites of Louis XV were common knowledge. And although French subjects did not begrudge their king's manly pleasures, the equally insatiable Henry IV remained the popular ideal of a good king. The latest official mistress, Mademoiselle du Barry, was little more than a prostitute from the streets of Paris. Her position made it impossible for her not to be drawn into politics, but her role was much criticized, for she was associated with the rise of Maupeou and Thierry, and the fall of the popular Duc de Choiseul. Thierry, in addition to arousing popular suspicions of promoting a famine pact, declared a partial bankruptcy which outraged all holders of government stocks. His later attempts to revise tax assessments and improve the efficiency of their collection soon won him the reputation of an extortioner. Maupeou attacks on the parliaments, meanwhile, raised a nationwide outcry. Although Voltaire, who always believed a strong and benevolent monarch was the best means of achieving reforms, applauded the striking down of a magistracy whom he saw as the obscurantist murderers of Calas and Labarre. Most other philosophers joined the general protest. "We are on the verge of a crisis," wrote Diderot as Maupeou struck, "which will end in slavery or in freedom. If it is slavery, it will be a slavery similar to that existing in Morocco or in Constantinople. If all the parliaments are dissolved, farewell any corrective principle preventing the monarch from degenerating into despotism." He, like everybody else, had absorbed the lessons of Montesquieu. A monarchy untempered by intermediary powers was a despotism, the worst of all governments, whose subjects enjoyed no rights and no security. The parliaments whatever their flaws, had seemed to offer the French some protection against authority. It was now shown to be an illusion. In the protests which greeted Maupeou's action, whether in printed remonstrances from the stricken courts or individual pamphlets, a new theme was heard: the Estates General. The ancient national representative body had not met since 1614, and nobody had more than the haziest notion of its composition or powers, but few doubted that it would have more authority than the parliaments. As Maupeou reforms established themselves and the initial clamor against him died down, so did the calls for the Estates General. But the idea was launched, and it kept recurring in political discussion over the ensuing decade and a half. After these traumas, the accession of Louis XVI was widely regarded as an opportunity for a new start. As the coffin of Louis XV was hustled away under cover of darkness, boundless hopes and expectations were invested in the sullied young monarch, but his unsullied qualities rapidly became a public joke. Married since 1770, he seemed incapable of stirring an heir, if not positively disinclined even to try. His first child, a daughter, only arrived in 1778, after medical attention. Meanwhile, pamphleteering ribaldry ran riot, much of it directed against the presumed frustrations of his queen. Her extravagance, frivolity, and indiscreet political meddling in turn made her an easy target, as her unpredictable brother, the Emperor Joseph II, blundered through international affairs, threatening to drag France at any moment into war on Austrian coattails. When in 1785 rumors arose that she wished to buy a fabulously expensive diamond necklace, nobody was surprised. A credulous courtier prelate, the Cardinal de Rohan, sought to ingratiate himself with her by securing it, but found himself merely the victim of an elaborate swindle. The Queen was not involved, but Rohan had to vindicate himself before the Parliament of Paris in 1786 in a show trial which inevitably cast implicit aspersions on her conduct. She took his acquittal as a personal insult, even though the perpetrators of the fraud were punished. The huge crowds which feted the cardinal after his release were plainly delighted at her humiliation, and went on to condemn the petulance of the royal reaction, which sent the acquitted Rohan immediately into provincial exile. With two sons now to his credit, born in 1781 and 1785, the king himself stood perhaps higher in public esteem than a decade earlier. But the scandal brought the whole world of the court into disrepute every bit as deep as that of Louis XV's final years, especially when, in 1787, its cost to the taxpayers was revealed for the first time. Nor did the restoration of the parliaments bring back the political confidence shattered by Maupeou. They returned to their various seats amid huge displays of popularity. But several soon squandered their credit in vicious quarrels between returner magistrates who had been exiled under Maupeou and remainers who had cooperated with him. That of Paris, after a show of resistance to the reforms of the physiocrat minister Turgot in 1775 and 1776, took no further stands against authority. No doubt, remarked a disgusted provincial judge in 1783, there was a time when the magistrates of that august tribunal, animated by the public will, gave forceful opposition to the ruinous enterprises of ministers. Today, enervated by the pleasures of a voluptuous life, led by ambition, they yield with blind deference to the monarch's wishes. The search, therefore, continued for institutions that would give France more effective protection against despotism, whether ministerial at the center or local, in the form of the intendants who wielded royal authority in the provinces. The intendants had never been more passive agents of their master. Their duties were so widely defined that the scope for independent initiative had always been wide. But during the later 18th century, they seemed to be interfering in more and more aspects of provincial life, driven by a mission to improve the lot of those whom, as they put it, they administered, whether the latter liked it or not. Some were avowed disciples of the physiocrats, like Turgot himself before he became a minister. All were believers in rationalizing wherever they could, and putting the latest knowledge to practical public use. But whether in forcing the alignment of streets, promoting inoculation against smallpox, moving insanitary graveyards from town centers, refusing to control bread prices, preventing the sale of deceased cattle, or devising schemes for forcing the poor to work, they outraged popular prejudices and intensified their basic unpopularity as agents of taxation. Their activity also brought them into conflict with other authorities like parliaments or provincial estates, whose members did not necessarily disagree with their enlightened ends, but challenged their authority to pursue them. And Intendant declared the Parliament of Besançon in September 1787 is subject to no inspection. His arbitrary activities, arbitrarily directed and executed, are regulated by no principle other than the most blind despotism. His absolute power, like that of his underlings, is completely exempt from all accountability and may, with impunity, effect the most shocking vexations. The answer to such problems was increasingly seen as provincial representative bodies in some form or other. Some provinces had them already, of course, in the form of estates. Pays d'État had intendants like other regions, but at least they could bargain with them and share some of their powers. In Brittany, the mid-1780s were marked by repeated clashes between the two, despite the obvious challenge to their own authority. More thoughtful magistrates in the parliaments had begun to advocate the establishment of estates or restoration of long defunct ones in their respective provinces from the late 1750s. In the 1770s, a number of sovereign courts, like the Paris Court of Aids and the parliaments of Grenoble and Bordeaux, took up the call, at least intermittently. Assemblies of leading landowners were also a favorite proposal among the physiocrats, although they had increasing doubts about estates as a model. They were too heterogeneous and tradition-bound. Turgot and his advisor while in office, Dupont de Nemours, dreamed of a uniform hierarchy of assemblies representing landowners from village or municipality level up to that of provinces. The only practical step to be taken before 1787, however, was the introduction of provincial administrations by Necker in 1778. These bodies of landowners, nominated in the first instance and comprising, like the estates of Languedoc, a quarter nobles, a quarter clergy, and 1/2 members of the third estate, sat not as representatives of ancient provinces, but as adjuncts to intendants in their generalities. Berry and Upper Guyenne received them first, and a third one was projected for the area around Boulogne when Necker lost power in 1781. It never came to fruition, But the other two and their intermediary commissions, when they were not sitting, functioned smoothly right down to the Revolution. A working, if much debated, model for a more representative way of administering the kingdom. Everything Necker did was much debated. In fact, his whole career and outlook was a standing challenge to established ways of doing things. A Swiss Protestant banker, largely self-made, he became well known in Paris intellectual society in the 1760s and early 1770s, thanks to his wife's much frequented salon. Here, while he sat silent and inscrutable, she carefully cultivated his reputation for financial wizardry and general wisdom. In the spring of 1775, at the height of the Flower War, he published a book advocating a controlled grain trade, much to the fury of Turgot and his free trading supporters. It won him enormous popularity. The beginning of a Neckeromania that lasted with ups and downs until 1790s and carried him, though a foreigner and member of a proscribed faith, to the directorship of the Treasury. Failure to find a more orthodox candidate showed how far established circles had already lost faith in their own capacities. In addition to his spectacular management of the finances, Necker began to reorganize central accounting procedures and the structure of taxation, commissioned a nationwide survey of venality of offices in the hope of curbing its excesses, and set up provincial assemblies, in part at least, to offset the influence of the parliaments. Above all, he made constant efforts to keep public opinion on his side, recognizing more clearly than anybody else so far the political importance of this new force that had emerged since mid-century. He discovered its limits too, when in 1781 he attempted to use his popularity to win a greater say in high policy making. He was rebuffed. Nor was Louis XVI intimidated when, in another break with precedent, he resigned in protest. But that only led him further down the path of innovation. Instead of returning to banking, he spent the next few years writing a defense of his record, De l'Administration des Finances, which laid bare in great detail how central government worked. Appearing in 3 volumes in 1785, it was an international bestseller, setting out its author's claims to be regarded as the natural alternative minister, whom the king must sooner or later recall to power if his government were to have any hope of retaining public confidence. But that was only the Neckerite view. Ministers still in power felt they had every right to public confidence. The most important policy the king had pursued, after all, had been gloriously successful. The humiliations of the 7 Years' War were finally avenged in 1783, when Great Britain was forced to recognize the independence of her North American colonies. French help on both land and sea had played a crucial part in this achievement. Scarcely less impressive had been the way peace was maintained on the European continent while the overseas struggle went on. No wonder Vergennes, the architect of these achievements and most important of the king's ministers after Maurepas died, viewed Necker's antics with some contempt. But apart from its cost, involvement in America raised a whole range of further discontents in France. Conservatives warned from the start that a king was unwise to give support to Republican rebels against a fellow monarch. But public interest in America had been stirred long before the colonists declared their independence by the quarrels that preceded the break. Readers were prepared for it, too, by the Histoire philosophique des deux Indes, appearing in 1772 under the name of the Abbé Raynal, though in fact a cooperative work whose contributors included Diderot. A sensational attack on European overseas expansion. It predicted the independence of colonial settlements and, as its prophecies came true, went through over 50 editions before the end of the century. From the start of their quarrel with British authority, the Americans used the language of liberty and representation, striking immediate echoes in a France obsessed with despotism. When John Adams arrived in Bordeaux in 1778, the first president of the local parliament welcomed him with the declaration that he could not avoid sympathizing with every sincere friend of liberty in the world. He had reason, he said, to feel for the sufferers in the cause of liberty, because he had suffered many years in that cause himself. He had been banished in the time of Louis XV for remonstrances against the arbitrary conduct and pernicious edicts of the court. Few Frenchmen knew much about America firsthand until the return of the 8,000 soldiers who served there. After the peace of 1783, Raynal, who published a further book on the revolt in 1780, had never made the voyage, and nor had the authors of many of the accounts of life in the New World, which attempted to satisfy public enthusiasm. But translations soon appeared of the key documents in the struggle, pamphlets like Paine's Common Sense, the Declaration of Independence, and the constitutions of several of the new states. And Parisian high society was conquered between 1777 and 1783 by the brilliant propaganda of Franklin, the new republic's ambassador, already famous as the inventor of the lightning conductor. His homespun philosophizing and simple style charmed the world of the court and the intellectual salons alike. He seemed a living advertisement for the virtues of Rousseauistic simplicity, the product of a sylvan paradise, far from the jaded artificiality of Europe. And although he flourished amid metropolitan glitter and declared publicly that he saw no prospect of changing it, he sponsored the first open attack on the principle of nobility. The renegade Count de Mirabeau's considerations on the Order of Cincinnatus, 1784, condemned a hereditary order of chivalry, which officers in the War of Independence had set up to commemorate their involvement. It was Franklin who brought the issue to Mirabeau's attention as returned French officers like the vainglorious Lafayette appeared in Paris flaunting the new society's insignia. Thus, issues raised in America reflected critically on French society as well as French politics. An interest in the new republic and the principles it stood for continued unabated after the peace. With the return of the veterans, it even grew better informed. But the most important thing about America did not depend on accurate information. It was the simple fact that new starts had been shown to be possible. Existing political authority could be thrown off, and institutions rebuilt from their foundations on more rational, freer lines. The improvement, the regeneration of human laws and institutions was no longer a mere matter of utopian dreaming. It was happening before men's eyes in America. As Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a jobbing journalist quick to cash in on every passing fashion, wrote when he read the most popular account of America, Crevecoeur's Letters of an American Farmer, in 1784. These letters will inspire or reawaken perhaps in blasé souls of Europeans the taste for virtue and the simple life. Energetic souls will find in them something more. They will see here a country, a government, where the desires of the hearts have been realized. a land which speaks to them in their own language. The happiness for which they have sighed finally does, in truth, exist. America appealed, in fact, to what Jean-Joseph Mounier, one of the leading revolutionaries of 1789, would later remember as a general restlessness and desire for change. It manifested itself in the vogue for wonders of all sorts. Whether Franklin's lightning rod, or the first manned flights in the hot air balloons seen rising over so many cities in 1783 and 1784, or a craze for mesmerism and miraculous cures affected by tapping the supposedly hidden natural forces of animal magnetism. Established religion might be losing its mystic appeal, but science was bringing other miracles to light. Seekers after this newer, truer wisdom believed themselves most likely to find it in the royal art of Freemasonry. Between 800 and 900 Masonic lodges were founded in France between 1732 and 1793. 2/3 of them after 1760. Between 1773 and 1779, well over 20,000 members were recruited. Few towns of any consequence were without one, or more lodges by the 1780s, and despite several papal condemnations of a deistic cult that had originated in Protestant England, the elite of society flocked to join. Voltaire was drafted in on his last visit to Paris, and it was before the assembled brethren of the Nine Sisters Lodge that he exchanged symbolic embraces with Franklin. Masonry was riddled with hierarchy. Women were excluded, although a handful of defiant all-female lodges appeared in 1780s. Men tended to join lodges where they would find their social peers, and there were innumerable grades of perfection through which adepts could pass. But within the lodges, Masons spoke of themselves as brothers and equals, and they elected their officers according to their talents, not their rank. Like the members of the literary societies mushrooming everywhere over the same period, most Masons were well-educated commoners, often, in fact, the same people, and in Masonry, their cultural equality was fully recognized. And whereas most Masonic assemblies consisted of rituals, followed by much eating and drinking, some brothers dreamed of putting the organization to more practical use. Philanthropic collections were organized. The Nine Sisters Lodge threw itself into the vindication of wronged innocents in the judicial crusades of the mid-1780s. Mostly, they steered clear of politics. But the sensational exposure in 1787 of a plot by self-styled Illuminati to use Masonic organization to subvert the government of Bavaria threw general suspicion onto a movement much of whose appeal lay in its secrecy. Beliefs in plots and conspiracies was yet another sign of the credulity of the times. The same cast of mind also tended to seek simple, universal formulae to resolve any problem, no matter how complex. Its limitations would be tragically exposed in the storm that was about to break. Chapter 3, Crisis and Collapse, 1776 to 1788. Ever since the disasters of the 7 Years' War, Frenchmen had longed to see British arrogance humbled and the power of the modern Carthage broken. By the time Louis XVI ascended the throne, that process seemed well underway. As the quarrel between Great Britain and her 13 North American colonies deepened, French observers looked on with growing interest. And by the spring of 1776, Vergennes, the foreign secretary, was convinced that Providence had marked out this moment for the humiliation of England. He persuaded the king that it would be to France's advantage to intervene. In April, secret supplies began to be sent to the Americans, and the first steps were taken to mobilize French naval strength. Thus began a deterioration in French relations with the British, which culminated in February 1778 in a treaty of alliance between France and the United States, followed by 5 years of all-out warfare. When it ended, the British Empire did indeed appear to have been shattered. France was revenged, and her international prestige stood gloriously restored. But the effort had brought the state to the brink of financial exhaustion. It had not been unforeseeable, aware of the burden of debt bequeathed by previous wars. Turgot had warned the king on assuming office as Comptroller General in 1774 that economies were essential to the restoration of financial health. otherwise. The first gunshot will drive the state to bankruptcy. A month before his fall from power, in May 1776, Turgot denounced Vergennes' proposal to intervene in America on the grounds that the cost would permanently destroy all hope of financial reform without necessarily helping to weaken Great Britain at all. On both counts, time proved him right. In 1776, however, Turgot's fellow ministers had lost faith in both his policies and his judgments. And in any case, within 6 months, a successor had been found who seemed confident of squaring the circle. In October 1776, Necker was appointed Director of the Treasury. Necker was not plucked from obscurity. He had carefully established himself as a man of influence and ability who offered alternatives to Turgot's austere policies. And his appointment aroused high expectations. He was determined not to increase taxes. He believed that ordinary income and expenditure could be brought into balance by economies and reorganization of budgetary structures to eliminate profiteering by financiers. Order in the finances would engender confidence, and confidence would enable the king to borrow money to meet extraordinary expenditure. The most extraordinary of all expenditure was that incurred by war. Necker financed French involvement in the American War almost entirely by loans. No new direct taxation was imposed while he was in power. Interest incurred on the loans was charged to ordinary expenditure, and Necker claimed to have found the extra money for this form of economies and ameliorations. Under this system, he raised 520 million livres in loans between 1777 and his resignation in May of 1781. Most of them were fully subscribed with remarkable speed, and the Parliament of Paris only raised difficulties over registering the first. Generous terms and high interest rates accounted for some of this success, but Necker believed its true foundation was public confidence in his management. In February of 1781, beset by a whispering campaign organized by a ministerial rivals and discontented financiers, He sought to sustain that confidence with an unprecedented gesture. With the consent of the king, he published the first ever public balance sheet of the French monarchy's finances. The Compte Rendu au Roi. It showed ordinary revenues to be exceeding expenditure by over 10 million livres. After 3 years of war and no increases in taxation, the public, which bought thousands of copies, was convinced. Nobody asked about extraordinary accounts where the real cost of the war was recorded. For the next 7 years, people would say, whenever ministers complained of financial difficulties, that affairs had been under control in Necker's time. This conviction would carry him back to power in 1788, but in 1781 the Compte Rendu prepared his downfall. Buoyed up by the public adulation it brought him, he sought to force the king to admit him to the innermost council, from which he was excluded by his religion. The king, advised by Maurepas and Vergennes, refused, and Necker resigned. The Compte Rendu had so identified Necker's personal credit with that of the state that the blow to confidence was substantial. His successor, Joly de Fleury, felt obliged at last to increase taxation, with predictable objections from several of the parliaments. These were overridden without much difficulty, however, and the new revenues enabled the crown to offer interest on further loans. Between May 1781 and the end of 1782, accordingly, almost 252 millions more were raised. All told, the American war cost France something over 1,066 million livres. And the expense did not end with the conclusion of peace in 1783. The third vingtième tax, introduced in July 1782, was to run until 3 years after the war ended, and Cologne, who became Comptroller General in November 1783, found himself obliged to go on borrowing.